Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight. My name is Patrick White. My beautiful wife and I, Kadina, outside helping everybody with the tickets. We are Conspiracy Culture Bookstore. So only my mom used to clap for me. So tonight we're very lucky. All the way from Los Angeles, California, we have Michael Cremo in the house tonight, known as the Forbidden Archaeologist. I'm sure you've heard him on Coast to Coast. I'm sure you've seen him on Ancient Aliens. He's spoken at various universities throughout the world. And we're very happy to have him here tonight for this particular group presenting Forbidden Archaeology. The book, I'm sure a lot of you have read it, has over the years become an underground classic, an underground bestseller. We carry it at the shop. All of Michael's books are over at the table there, available preferably at the end of the lecture. He's also currently working on Forbidden Archaeology 2. So for those of you that have actually read the first book, you'll know just how, I'm sure you're probably just as anxious now that you know that it's in the works for it to come out. So tonight, again, Forbidden Archaeology. Michael Cremo, the Forbidden Archaeologist. Let's hear a warm round of applause. Michael will present roughly for about an hour. Once the PowerPoint presentation wraps up, we'll open it up for a Q&A. Go about 45 minutes or an hour, or just we'll gauge how enthused you guys are and how alert everybody is. And then once that wraps up, Michael will be available for a meet and greet, a book signing if you want to take some photos or whatnot. Everything's copacetic and rocking. So without any further ado, let's welcome Michael A. Cremo, the Forbidden Archaeologist, to the stage.
Would it be possible?
Everyone.
Would it be possible to improve the microphone? You know, it's not coming across very clearly.
Well, I dropped out of high school in grade 11, so you're asking me how to operate university equipment. That's a bit of a leap for me.
Well, maybe somebody here in the university would know.
Okay, we're going to be using this microphone.
Is that a little bit better for you, Douglas?
You know, it's not going to be perfect,
Yes,
but that's better?
yes.
Okay.
All right. And I just forgot, because I always get nervous when I have to talk in front of crowds. We're also doing another event on Sunday, October 20th, which is not this Sunday, but the following week. It's a little bit of a different focus and a bit of a different subject matter, but it's called MK Ultra and Project Monarch, A Survivor's Tale. And it's all about government-sponsored mind control. And we have survivor Kathy O'Brien and her rescuer, Mark Phillips, coming to talk about MK Ultra and Project Monarch. And doing the introduction will be Hollywood television legend Roseanne Barr. So she'll be talking about mind control in Hollywood, mind control in pop culture, just how it's utilized, just how pervasive it is. So that should be something. Kadina's got tickets. They're $25 at the door. Tonight they're going to be $15. So we've got some outside, and they'll be available after the talk. I've spoken way too long. Again, Michael A. Cremo, the Forbidden Archaeologist. Let's give him some love.
Trying to get some of these lights out. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to thank Patrick and Kadina for arranging this wonderful event. Thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here this evening to hear something about forbidden archaeology, evidence for extreme human antiquity. So first of all, I'll introduce myself as a researcher in human origins for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. My work in human origins is inspired by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. So this may seem a bit unusual in these days to be mixing science and spirituality. But I've found there's quite a bit of interest in these things, even within the mainstream scientific circles. I've been invited to make presentations on my work at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and many other such institutions throughout the world. So the question that I'm dealing with is, how old is our human species? And today, the most common answer to that question comes from the modern followers of Charles Darwin. And they tell us that the first humans like us appeared on Earth less than 200,000 years ago. They would say before that time there were no humans like us present on Earth. There were only more primitive ape-like human ancestors. However, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell a different story. They inform us that humans like us have existed for many millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on this planet. So, if that's true, then we could make a prediction. If what these ancient Sanskrit writings say is true, then there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 200,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So my methodology for testing that hypothesis or prediction was to carefully examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin until the present, and not just in English. I have a reading knowledge of German, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, many of the major European languages. So I looked at reports, not just in English, but in all these different languages. And doing that research took about 8 years of continuous work. And my results were as follows. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature textbooks. I divide the scientific literature into two parts, primary and secondary. By primary scientific literature, I mean original reports by scientists, archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, published in the professional scientific literature. By secondary literature, I mean literature that's based on the primary literature, like textbooks, survey studies, and things like that. So, first finding, not so surprising. You're not going to find any reports of human beings existing millions of years ago in the current secondary literature, the textbooks. Now, my second finding was a little more interesting, namely that there are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. So I collected those reports and put them into this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which many of you have. As you can see, it's quite a big book, 900 pages. Therefore, some people call it Forbidden Archaeology. And this book was reviewed in most of the professional scientific journals that deal with the question of human origins. In other words, the book made an impact in the scientific world. Of course, it's a very controversial book. So, as you might expect, many of the reviews were quite angry reviews, negative reviews, but some of the reviews acknowledge some positive aspects, even from the point of mainstream science. For example, David Oldroyd, a noted historian of science, and his co-author wrote in Social Studies of Science a 21-page review of the book. And he asked the question, so, has Forbidden Archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? That's the science of human origins. He said, our answer is a guarded yes for two reasons. First, he said, much of the historical material has not been scrutinized in such detail before. In other words, he's a professional historian of science, focusing on the science of human origins. And he said he had never seen a book that went into the history of archaeology in such detail before. So he thought that was a positive scientific contribution. And second, he said, the book raises, quote, a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. In other words, scientists attach different levels of certainty to their theories. Some they think are more certain than others. Now, they consider their current theories of human origins to be almost absolutely certain. And David Oldroyd thought that in our book, Forbidden Archaeology, we had done a good job in problematizing, attaching that level of certainty to the current scientific theories of human origins. He thought maybe they ought to bring it down a notch. So this book, Forbidden Archaeology, is, as I said, 900 pages long. So some people asked for a shorter version. So we did bring out a shorter version called The Hidden History of the Human Race. Now, immediately after these books were published, I started making presentations about the subject matter of the book at major international scientific conferences. The first time I did that was in 1994. I presented a paper called Puranic Time in the Archaeological Record at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress in New Delhi. The Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India. They describe a cyclical concept of time, and they say that humans have been present throughout all these vast cycles of time, going back millions of years, much further in time than 200,000 years. And there's archaeological evidence to support that idea. So I thought this meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, which is the world's largest international organization of archaeologists, would be a good place to present the kind of information that I'm talking about, especially since that meeting was being held in India. So that paper was later published in a peer-reviewed scientific book called Time in Archaeology, which was published by Routledge, a major scientific publisher. So sometimes people ask, do you have peer-reviewed scientific publications? And the answer is yes, I do have peer-reviewed scientific publications, and this is one of them. Many of them are included in my latest book, My Science, My Religion, which is a collection of 24 papers that I've presented at major international scientific conferences. So there is archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, but my question was, why is this evidence not found in today's secondary scientific literature, like textbooks at colleges and universities? And the answer, I believe, is a process of knowledge filtration that goes on in the world of science. You know, we can call the blue box there the knowledge filter. And what it represents is the dominant consensus today among scientists about this question of human origins. And that's the Darwinian evolutionary consensus, which says no humans like us existed before 200,000 years ago. So evidence that conforms to that consensus will pass through that filter very easily. And that means you'll see it in the textbooks. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts the dominant consensus, it tends to be filtered out, which means we don't hear very much about it. And one of the reviewers of Forbidden Archaeology understood this point that we were trying to make. This was a review, was originally published in the French language in L'Anthropologie by Marilyn Patoumati, who is a French archaeologist. She wrote, Cremo and Thompson have written a provocative work that raises the problem of the influence of the dominant ideas of a time period on scientific research. These ideas can compel the researchers to orient their analyses according to the conceptions that are permitted by the scientific community. So that's more or less stating in academic language what we were talking about when we spoke of knowledge filtration. The dominant consensus ideas in the scientific community can influence how scientists treat evidence that comes to their attention. And the effect is that they filter out the evidence that radically contradicts their dominant consensus. Now I'm going to give some examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. I'm going to be starting with some discoveries that are fairly close to what most scientists are now prepared to accept in terms of how old our human species is. And then gradually I'm going to go further and further back in time. So this is Virginia Steen McIntyre, an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young scientist just starting out in her career in geology, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Hueyatlaco. It's in central Mexico near the town of Puebla. A team of archaeologists, Mexican and American archaeologists, had uncovered stone tools and weapons there. And this is the excavation at Hueyatlaco. It was a very professional excavation. The artifacts were photographed in place in the layers of rock in which they were found. And of course, the archaeologists were interested to know how old these things were. So they called a team of geologists to the site to date it. And Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 scientific methods to date the site, and I'll mention a couple of them. In the same layers with the stone tools, animal bones with cut marks on them were found. And the geologists used the uranium series method to date those bones. They got an age of 245,000 years. Above the layer with the stone tools and the animal bones was a layer of volcanic ash. The geologists used the zircon fission trap method to date those layers of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. Using all 4 methods that they employed, the geologists concluded the site must be at least 250,000 years old. But the archaeologists said, that's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts did not exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago, and what to speak of being present in North America. Their current idea is that there were no humans in North America any earlier than about 20,000 years ago maximum. So the archaeologists refused to publish the report given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. So this upset Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues. So they decided to independently publish the age for the site. But when they did that, they experienced, this is the report that they published. When they published this report, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world because they had dared to publish something that so radically contradicted the dominant consensus on human antiquity. And Virginia Steen McIntyre lost a teaching position that she held at a university in the United States, and she had been a rising star in her profession, but suddenly her career was finished because she had dared publish something like this. And she wrote to the editor of the journal that was courageous enough to publish a report. Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayalaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period. So this is how this knowledge filtering process can operate. Now I'm going to go back a little further into the history of archaeology. This is Jacques Boucher de Pere, who was one of the founders of archaeology in the mid-19th century. He lived in France. And at a place called Moulins-Quignon, near the town of Abbeville in northeastern France, in the Somme River Valley, he conducted an excavation, and in this excavation he found an anatomically modern human jawbone. He found it in this layer of his excavation here, along with many stone tools and weapons. Now, according to modern geologists, this layer here at Moulins-Quignon is about 430 1,000 years old. So it was quite a controversial discovery. There were intense debates about this anatomically modern human jawbone being found in such ancient deposits. So many of the scientists proposed, okay, here's what probably happened. Somebody probably went to a nearby Roman cemetery, a couple thousand years old, got a jawbone from this Roman cemetery, then went secretly to the excavation, buried it for Jacques Boucher de Perret to find. And that's the explanation. And actually, this is what you see in the textbooks today about this discovery. What we don't see in the textbooks is that after Boucher de Perret heard these accusations that he had been the victim of a hoax, he went and conducted additional excavations in the same location. And he conducted these new excavations under conditions which completely ruled out this hoax hypothesis. And in these new excavations, which were witnessed by other professional scientists, he uncovered 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth from the same formations. So I think what we have here is evidence that humans like us were existing over 400,000 years ago in Europe. And I reported on this case in this paper that I presented at the 20th International Congress for History of Science. It was later published in the peer-reviewed proceedings of that Congress. So in the early 20th century, an interesting discovery was made in Buenos Aires in Argentina. An anatomically modern human skull cap, the top part of a human skull, was found in an excavation there. The excavation went down about 45 feet. At that layer, the diggers encountered a thick layer of limestone rock, locally called Tosca, and they broke through that layer of rock and found the skull at that level in the Pre-Ensenada Formation, which is, according to modern geologists, is 1,500,000 years old. This discovery was reported to the scientific world by a prominent Argentine scientist, Florentino Ameghino, but we don't read about it in the textbooks today. I reported on this case and several other cases like it at the meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was held in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999. Now, many people have heard of Olduvai Gorge in Africa. Many important discoveries have been made there, but most people are not aware of the first discovery that was made there. In 1913, the German scientist Hans Reck reported that he discovered a fairly complete anatomically modern human skeleton there. And this is the skull from that skeleton. The skeleton was found in the upper part of bed 2 at Olduvai Gorge. And according to modern geologists, bed 2 goes from 1.7 million years at the bottom to 1.15 million years at the top. So it's over 1.15 million years old. And Rex said he found the skeleton solidly embedded in the rock, and he had to use a hammer and chisel to take it out of the rock in which it was embedded. So it was a very controversial discovery. There were decades of debates about this discovery through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. Many people thought the debate was finally settled in the 1960s and 70s when a German scientist named Rainer Proch did a radiocarbon date on a fragment of bone he said was from the original skeleton, and he got an age of less than 10,000 years. So many people thought, okay, that settles it. It's not over 1 million years old, it's less than 10,000 years old. But I don't agree with that resolution to the debate. First of all, Rainer Proch was later forced to resign from his position as an anthropology professor at Frankfurt University in Germany after an academic court there found him guilty of falsifying dozens of radiocarbon dates during his long career there. And there's a second problem, and that is that actually Rex skeleton was lost during World War II. It was in a museum that was bombed in Germany. So where did he get the fragment of bone that he said was from the original skeleton? He said, well, in another museum he found a box that had some tiny fragments of bone, and he claimed it was from the original skeleton. I'm not so sure of that. So I don't think a radiocarbon date on a fragment of bone that probably wasn't even from the original skeleton by a scientist who was convicted for forging dozens of radiocarbon dates can be taken as a resolution to the question of how old the skeleton is. I think the best evidence that we have for the age of that skeleton is the report of the original investigator, Hans Reck, who found it solidly embedded in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. In 1867, Dr. Robert Collier reported that an anatomically human jaw was found at a place called Foxhall in England. It was found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation there, and Foxhall is located near the town of Ipswich on the east coast of England. And according to modern geologists, the Red Crag Formation in which this human jawbone was found is between 2 and 3 million years old. In 1979, Mary Leakey announced the discovery of footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania, East Africa. The footprints were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash that had been dated using the potassium-argon method as being 3,700,000 years old. In her original report, published in National Geographic magazine, Mary Leakey said, the Laetoli footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. Other scientists also agree. Paleontologist Tim White said, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that humans like us made those footprints. According to their understanding, humans like us first came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. So how did they explain the footprints? Well, they said about 3-4 million years ago in Africa, there must have existed some type of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet. And that's how the footprints were made. Now, that's an interesting idea. However, there is no physical evidence to support that idea. We have the skeletons of the ape men who existed at that time. They're called Australopithecus. And the foot bones of Australopithecus have been discovered in a place called Sterkfontein in South Africa. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's like that of a chimpanzee with long toes, sort of like human fingers, and a first toe that can move out to the side like a human thumb. Actually, the only creature known to science today from skeletal evidence that has a foot exactly like a modern human foot is a human being like ourselves. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think she found evidence that humans like us were existing between 3 and 4 million years ago in Africa. Now, some people might say, okay, footprints are a little bit ambiguous. It would be better if you had some human skeletons that were 3 or 4 million years old. And such things have been reported in the professional scientific literature. In the late 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni reported excavating several human skeletons at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. This is the skull cap from one of these human skeletons. He found them in a formation about 4 million years old, according to modern geologists. I went to that village of Castanedolo, and I met this gentleman there, and he gave me a copy of a very rare geological report about this discovery. And from the information in the report, we were able to locate the place where the discovery was made. Now, when some scientists hear that an anatomically modern human skeleton has been found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they say, okay, this is very easy to explain. Here's what probably happened. Maybe 4,000 years ago, somebody died on the surface there, and then his comrades dug a grave, put the body down into that very ancient layer of rock, and that's why you think you've got a discovery of a human skeleton 4 million years old. Now, things like this can happen. They do happen. Technically, it's called intrusive burial. But Ragazzoni, the discoverer, was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this problem. And he said, if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, as we see here. And he looked very carefully when he was taking the skeleton out of the ground, and he could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed, which means the skeletons really did belong in the layers of rock in which they were found, in this case, about 4 million years old. Now we're going to jump even further back in time. This is the Portuguese geologist Carlos Ribeiro, and he discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal in layers of rock about 20 million years old. And as a professional geologist, he said they cannot have come down into those very ancient layers of rock from some more recent levels. He checked very carefully to rule out that possibility. He displayed these artifacts in these cases here in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. But if you go to the museum today, you will not see the artifacts on display here anymore. Today they're kept locked in these cabinets behind me. But when I went to the museum, I got permission from the directors to open up those cabinets. And I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal. And these are some of them. And I also studied in the museum archives the original papers of Dr. Ribeiro, his maps, his field notes, and things like that. And after doing that, I went into the countryside of Portugal to relocate some of the places where he made his discoveries. For example, this is the quarry at Morganheira, where he found human artifacts in layers of rock 20 million years old. This is one of the artifacts he found there. It's an implement made of flint. It's got a nice point on it with some use marks showing how it was used 20 million years ago. It's got his original label on it in the museum collection. Now, it's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed these artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels showing an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. This is the label that they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. It's the second line gives the age. It says Paleolithico Superior. That means the upper Paleolithic period. So, according to archaeologists, that period, the upper Paleolithic in Europe, goes back about 20,000 years. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. That can't possibly be true. 20,000 years sounds better. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum just put the whole collection away in the 1950s. And I'm the first researcher to see these things in decades. I gave a report about this case at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists that took place in Lisbon, Portugal in 2001. And I thought that would be a good place to talk about these things, and it actually was, because some Portuguese archaeologists became very interested in what I had to say, and later they published that paper in a peer-reviewed scientific publication called the Journal of Iberian Archaeology. That's the archaeology of Spain and Portugal. That paper is included in my most recent book, My Science, My Religion, along with many of the color photographs that I took of Ribeiro's artifacts. Now, one case that's always really fascinated me is the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, miners went to California to get the gold, and they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains at places like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains near Sonora, California, and Tuolumne County. And to get the gold, they were digging these tunnels, and deep inside the tunnels in the solid rock, the miners were finding human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles. They also found obsidian spear points. And what makes these discoveries so interesting to me is that they were found in layers of solid rock that belonged to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means they'd be about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported initially to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University, but we don't read about these things in the textbooks today because of the process of knowledge filtration. And this is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. It's the anthropologist William Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And he wrote, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human origins, he would not have published that report. In other words, he should have known that these things could not possibly be that old. He shouldn't have published them. He should simply have forgotten about them. And basically, that's what happened. However, a few years ago, some years ago, I was a consultant for a documentary called The Mysterious Origins of Man that was shown on the NBC network. And it was produced by a man named Bill Cote, who also did some very good documentaries about the Sphinx, the age of the Sphinx and the pyramids. Bill Cote had gotten a copy of my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he wanted to include some cases from the book in this documentary, which, do we have copies of the documentary here? We do have some. One left. But I told him about the California gold mine discoveries, and he thought that was a pretty interesting case. So I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. So he did go there, but the museum officials refused to allow him to see the artifacts. They said, well, you probably have a very tight deadline. We just wouldn't have time to go into our collections and find these things for you. And he said, no, I've got several months to do that. And they said, well, we have another problem. We would have to pay our staff overtime. Bill Cote said, I'll pay all the overtime expenses. And finally, they just said, no. Now, later, I was able to go, it's interesting what happened. Although he wasn't able to go in and get new video footage of the artifacts, we were able to find some photographs that Dr. Whitney had taken in the 19th century. So he did wind up with some images he could use in The Mysterious Origins of Man. But it was really interesting what happened when scientists found out that NBC was going to show this documentary featuring my work and the work of others in the alternative history field like Graham Hancock and Robert Ball, John Anthony West, and others. Scientists were outraged. They tried to stop NBC from showing the documentary. They weren't successful. NBC did show it several times. So that really outraged these scientists. So they went to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the United States government that licenses and regulates the television industry. and they tried to get the government to investigate NBC, censure NBC. They wanted the government to force NBC to broadcast an apology for having shown the documentary, and they also wanted the government to fine NBC millions of dollars so they would never do something like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the government didn't do any of that, but I thought it was very interesting that these kinds of attempts were made. Later, I was able to get into the museum collections myself. I'm a member of the World Archaeological Congress, and I had made a proposal to present a paper about the California gold mine discoveries at their next big international congress. That proposal was accepted. So I was able to go to the museum officials with that letter of acceptance. On that basis, they decided they would let me personally see the artifacts for my personal scientific research, not for television broadcast or anything like that. But the artifacts are not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum. And, you know, to get there, you have to be accompanied by a museum official. You go through all kinds of heavy security. I mean, sometimes people think it's just something from Indiana Jones movies, that there's strange stuff in museum collections that you don't get to see normally, but it's not just an Indiana Jones movie type of thing. So we did get in to see them, and those are some of the artifacts from the as you can see, it's in a storage building several miles from the museum. And then I went into the mountains of California. This is Table Mountain as it looks today. And we were able to find some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were originally discovered. And it should be possible to do more research there. And this is the paper that I presented at the meeting of the World Archaeological Congress about these discoveries. That meeting was held in 2003 in Washington, D.C. And this paper is included in my most recent book, My Science, My Religion. So, how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County in the state of Illinois in the United States. According to the report, above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken. And that's an important detail because it rules out the intrusion idea, namely that the skeleton could have come down through some fissure or some burial into the ancient layer of rock in which it was found. According to geologists of the State Geological Survey of Illinois, this layer here below the slate rock at that location is about 300 million years old. So this report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic base that was found 15 feet deep in solid rock in Dorchester, Massachusetts. It's part of the Boston area. And it was a beautiful vase with silver inlaid floral patterns in it. And according to geologists of the United States Geological Survey, the age of the formation at that location, at that depth, is about 600 million years. So, actually, you know, I could keep you here from now until Christmas, going through one case after another, but, you know, I'm not going to do that. I just wanted to give a representative sample of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. There are hundreds of these cases, literally. And the implication of this evidence is that it contradicts the dominant theory today about human origins and antiquity. And this was recognized by one of the architects of that whole theory, the anthropologist William W. Howells of Harvard University. When Forbidden Archaeology first came out, he got a copy of it and he read it. And he wrote me a letter. And in this letter, he said, Forbidden Archaeology represents much careful effort in critically assembling published materials. I thought it was nice that he recognized that as a professional scientist. And he went on to say, most of us in the world of science, mistakenly or not, see human evolution with man emerging rather late. To have modern human beings appearing a great deal earlier would be devastating to the whole theory of evolution. So he recognized the implications of the evidence that was reported in Forbidden Archaeology. That is the implication, that if it is accepted, it would be pretty devastating, not just to the current ideas about human origins, but to the whole theory of evolution. So another archaeologist wrote a review of Forbidden Archaeology in British Journal for the History of Science. And as I said, most of the reviews of Forbidden Archaeology in the professional scientific literature are really quite harshly negative, but some of the scientists who reviewed it did acknowledge there were some positive aspects to it. Tim Murray wrote that Forbidden Archaeology, quote, provides the historian of archaeology with a useful compendium of case studies in the history and sociology of scientific knowledge, which can be used to foster debate within archaeology about how to describe the epistemology of one's discipline. And really, that's exactly what we were trying to do with Forbidden Archaeology in terms of the scientific and academic world. Of course, I have lots of different audiences for my work. I have my audience of conspiracy theorists, and my audience of ufologists, and I have lots of different audiences that I deal with, but one of them is the mainstream scientific audience. And what I was trying to do with that audience is get them to think about the epistemology of their discipline. Epistemology is the science of studying how knowledge is acquired, what is knowledge, how is it acquired, how do you look at evidence, how do you evaluate evidence. So that's what I was trying to do with Forbidden Archaeology, get a debate started in archaeological circles about the epistemology of their discipline. And this shows that I was successful in doing that, getting them to start talking about these things. Tim Murray also wrote in his review, Forbidden Archaeology is designed to demolish the case for biological and cultural evolution and to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative. Now, that's kind of an important statement. I mean, he's correct. I plead guilty. Forbidden Archaeology was designed to demolish the case for biological and cultural evolution of the Darwinian kind. Guilty as charged. And to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative. I've been very open in my work in acknowledging the Vedic inspiration for what I do. Now, it's at this point that many in the world of science get very upset with me because they don't think that it's legitimate to bring into a scientific discussion some kind of spiritual angle. Now, I talk about this extensively in my book, My Science, My Religion. But it's interesting what Murray had to say about this. He said in this review, the dominant paradigm has changed and is changing, and practitioners openly debate issues which go right to the conceptual core of the discipline. Whether the Vedas have a role to play in this is up to the individual scientist concerned. Now, I think that's an enlightened position. Some people are in the scientific world going to say, no, you cannot bring in any kind of perspective like that. You cannot bring in, say, a First Nation perspective or a Vedic perspective or any other kind of perspective drawn from some traditional worldview. That, they think, is illegitimate. But I think Murray's position is actually correct. It's up to the individual scientist if they want to do that or not. There shouldn't be any ban on what scientists can do of that sort. So I thought that was a positive development. And I think there are enough people who agree with him in the world of science that make it possible for me to speak about my Vedic perspectives on human origins at major international scientific conferences and universities around the world. Now, some scientists are very upset that I do that, but others are willing to listen. And I think that's very important, because if ideas are going to change, the very first thing has to be a willingness to listen to new ideas and not keep them out of the discussion. So I'm going to end this with sharing with you some of my experiences in presenting this kind of thing to university audiences around the world. Tonight we're speaking at a university. I don't know how many students or professors from the university are here. Anybody? Okay, all from outside the university community, apparently. Unless there's somebody here who just doesn't want to identify themselves. Well, my books are now published in about 20 different languages, and I speak at universities all over the world. One of the languages in which my books are published is Russian. So I've been to Russia a few times, and I've spoken at universities there from one end of the country to another, from Vladivostok to Moscow to St. Petersburg, a whole lot of places. And most of the lectures have gone on without any problem. However, at one university there was a problem. It's the Tyumen State University, which is in Siberia, in one of the big oil towns that have opened up in Siberia. As many of you know, Russia's wealth is pretty much based on its oil and natural gas industry. So there have been huge developments and huge cities springing up in Siberia connected with that. So some professors at Tyumen State University invited me to speak about my Forbidden Archaeology work. And a lecture was scheduled. But the day before the lecture, the president of the university canceled the lecture because other faculty members in the university were very upset that I was being allowed to speak there. First of all, because I was saying something that contradicted the theory of human evolution. Second, I was doing it from a Vedic perspective. Either one of the things would have been bad enough, but both of them was just too much. So the professors who invited me tried to get the president of the university to change his mind. But the pressure from the other side was just too great, so he wouldn't change his mind. So then the professors who invited me went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which in terms of the academic hierarchy in Russia is higher than the university. And they spoke to the director there. And he said, okay, if they won't let him speak at the university, he can speak here at the Russian Academy of Sciences. So they had buses bring students and professors from the university to the Russian Academy of Science building. And the professors who invited me said, more students and professors came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university. Because everybody was wondering, what is this man going to say that's so dangerous? His lecture was canceled. So it was a really interesting event, and then afterwards I had a private meeting with the local director of the Russian Academy of Sciences and some of the scientists who had invited me to speak. And it was a very nice conversation. And then something interesting happened the next year. The next year, I went back to the same university and I spoke in the biology department there, no problem. I guess they decided, better just let him speak and let the students make up their minds about it. I mean, he's only going to be here one day. We have them all the rest of the year. So, and this doesn't happen, just in, Russia I have found to be in many ways a very open country. I was allowed to speak at the Russian Academy of Sciences main headquarters in Moscow. I have not been given such an invitation from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science up to this point. And once I was invited to the University of Indiana in Bloomington, Illinois. Same thing, I was invited by faculty members to give a lecture. Other faculty members found out about it, put pressure on the administration canceled the lecture. Unfortunately, there wasn't a local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences I could go to. So the lecture was held in the public library in Bloomington, and whoever wanted to come came to that. So if that didn't happen a couple of times a year, I couldn't call myself a forbidden archaeologist anymore. So it's something that goes with the territory. But for those who are interested to see what kinds of presentations I do make at mainstream international scientific conferences, you could have a look at my latest book, My Science, My Religion, which is a collection of 24 such papers. And these other books are also there. They're available tonight. Patrick?
Yes, sir.
How are we doing? What's the
Doing
next part of the program?
You want to start the Q&A now?
We can do that. Should I?
Yeah, if you want to maybe, if anybody has a question that they would like to ask Mr. Cremo, I would just suggest raising your hand, and then I guess Mr. Cremo will sort of, maybe say, okay, the guy in the purple sweater, the lady in the red hat, or, the guy wearing the anonymous mask.
Okay,
we'll just take
I'll
it from
try
there.
to get people from all the different segments of the audience, front and rear, side, middle, everything. We'll turn on the lights, yes. Okay, is that, want more lights? More lights? No?
Well, thank you very much for the presentation.
Just to add on to what Mr. Cremo was saying about how he truly is a forbidden archaeologist, when we started promoting this event, we had contacted several of the professors and whatnot from the archaeology departments here in the university, and the general consensus was
peddle your superstition elsewhere. And they were very angry and very short and very frustrated. So we felt it here. And then of course the doors were supposed to be open, but they were locked until like 6:35. They were supposed to be open at 5:45. The heat's been on all night. I've been running around like a chicken with my head cut off trying to like remedy all of these things which have been completely out of my control. So from the bottom of my heart, I apologize for anybody that felt it to be a little bit too warm. I apologize if I was short and snapped with anybody, because again, it's just been an extremely frustrating evening, but it ended up very well. You've all been very patient and very beautiful. So give yourself a round of applause. And we'll do the Q&A until Michael decides he's tired, and then we'll do the meet and greet.
Start on this side. Yes.
Mr. Cremo, I have a question about like the human findings. Where the body pieces are larger than was the human being that 50 million years ago was it different from modern human being?
So did everybody hear the question?
Yeah.
Okay. I have concentrated up to this point in discoveries of human bones that are within the modern human size range. And there's a reason for that. I believe that in the past there were large-sized human beings. The problem, and there are many reports of such things, the problem is, up to this point in time, I have not been able to personally verify and confirm any of them. As you saw from my presentation, I like to get into the museums, get into the collections, actually see and verify the existence of different kinds of discoveries. That's something I like to do. I'm not able to do it for every single case, but at least in some cases I'm able to do that. So I would, there are many reports. Of course, we have to be very careful. On the web, we see circulating many photographs of large-sized human skeletons. Up to this point in time, I haven't been able to verify any of them personally, so I'm a little cautious about such things. Once, a few years ago, I thought I was finally going to be able to verify a discovery. There was a businessman in New Zealand who had read some of my books, and he arranged for me to come to New Zealand to give some lectures. And he met me at the airport in Auckland, and he told me, tomorrow we're going to see something very interesting. He told me a friend of his since childhood was working at the Natural History Museum in Auckland, and he was going to show us the skeleton of a human being from one of the Pacific Islands over 10 feet tall. So, there are lots of people today 7 feet tall. They play on the basketball teams. And there's even 1 or 2 people living today who are 8 feet tall, but nobody 10 feet tall. I haven't seen, anyways. So I thought, finally, I'm going to be able to confirm one of these things. We went to the museum the next morning. The man met us, took us all around, showing us the dinosaurs and everything. And finally, we asked, well, what about the large-sized human skeleton? He said, I'm sorry, we can't see it. So I had to wonder, well, what happened in 24 hours that he told us when he was going to show this, and then when we went there, he didn't. So, or when I was in Russia, people told me in a mosque in Samarkand, there's the body of a saint 24 feet tall in a tomb. So I don't know, how am I going to get, Americans aren't very welcome in those parts of the world, poking around in mosques at this point in time. But thank you for that question. Gentleman in the black shirt.
All of
the dating of the artifacts and the bodies and the human style, modern human jawbones and that, the way you were describing it in the lecture, it sounds like all the dating was based on them being found in particular layers of rock, and that the rock is dated to be 50 million years old, or that layer is 10 million years old.
Yes.
The actual artifacts or the body or the bones that they found, have they been dated themselves, or
Okay.
is there any, I would imagine that they have been dated and they're keeping it hidden somewhere. What are there any records of the dating?
Well, let me answer that. First of all, did everybody hear the question?
Yes.
Okay, pretty much everybody heard. So, the dating methods have different ranges. Say if we're talking about bone, you could use the radiocarbon method to date bone directly. But that method goes back at most 100,000 years because it's based on the half-life of carbon-14. Carbon-14 is a radioactive element which decays by a half-life. And the half-life is around 5,000 years. So that means every 5,000 years it decreases by half. By the time you go back about 20 half-lives, nothing really measurable. So another method that can be used directly to date bone is the uranium series method, which is not considered to be as accurate, and it's only useful for several 100,000 years. If we're talking about millions of years, there is no method that scientists can use today to directly date bone. For example, if they find dinosaur bones, which they would believe to be 65 million years old or older, there is no method that they could use to directly date it. Now, there have been some isolated cases where it might preserve some organic material or something, but usually, when we're talking about millions of years, there isn't any method which you can use to date bone directly. And that is why I refer to age of formations. And then what you have to demonstrate is that the bone belongs in the layer in which it was found. It did not get there intrusively, which is why I talked about that point extensively. Now, if we're talking about, because there are methods, radiometric methods, using radioactive isotopes with longer half-lives that can be used to date layers of rock millions and millions of years old. So that is why I was referring to human bones being found in layers of rock millions of years old, dated by geologists as such. Now, if you're talking about artifacts, say stone artifacts, you could use certain radiometric methods to date how old the stone actually is, but that doesn't tell you when it was made into an artifact. There again, you have to rely on the age of the formation in which it is found, the archaeological layer in the formation in which it's found. So that's a good question, but that's my reply. Now, was there anybody in this section? Yes.
So, have there been any finds of extreme antiquity after the Steen McIntyre find?
So the question is, have there been any finds?
Or you specifically?
Have there been any finds of extreme human antiquity after Virginia Steen McIntyre? Yes, fairly recently, within the past 3 or 4 years, footprints were discovered in Kenya. And they were anatomically modern. They were found in layers of rock about 1.5 million years old. So it's the usual thing. You know, the scientists, this is how this knowledge filtering process works. It shows the influence of the dominant consensus. They looked at them. It couldn't be humans like us. Must have been some kind of ape man who had feet just like modern human feet. You know, so I reported on that in one of my Atlantis Rising columns. I think I called the column, "Can You Believe It?" And there are cases which I have under investigation, and which I'll include in the book that Patrick White referred to in his introductory remarks. That's what I'm working on now, is putting together all of the cases that have come to my attention since the original book was written. But that book took me 8 years, because I try to be very careful in my research, look at all the dating studies and reports, and do a really thorough job. But there are other cases. There's even one case, again, of footprints found at Huayatlaco, near Huayatlaco. Footprints were found in some of the layers of volcanic ash there. And initially, they thought they were about 40,000 years old, but then some very prominent scientists came, a team of geologists from the United States, and did very extensive dating studies of the layers of ash, and found they were about 1.5 million years old. And therefore they decided those can't be real footprints. It's just, they're not real footprints, because they're like those of a modern human being, but modern humans didn't exist at that time. So, and there's more, but I'm working on them now. We'll come back this way. So I went to the back first time, so towards the front this time.
The artifacts that you find, what do they tell us about the people that lived back then? Like, what was their culture, society, the technology level like?
So the question has to do with, what do the artifacts that we find tell us about the culture of the people? Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is that we may not have a perfect record of everything that these people in ancient times had in terms of technology. And that's because a lot of things that we consider to be high tech and things like that don't preserve very well over vast periods of time. And this has come up in modern ecological studies. Our huge technological civilization that we have today has caused negative impacts on the environment, on the earth. So many scientists wondered, well, what would happen if human beings disappeared today? What would happen to all our stuff? How long would it take the earth to return to a more natural state? And there have been scientific studies and documentaries on Discovery Channel and National Geographic. One of them is called World Without Us. And the reason I was interested in this is it was kind of interesting what they were saying. It was a multidisciplinary study with people analyzing, well, what would happen to the cities, like all our metal stuff would oxidize over thousands and thousands of years. So they decided after a few 100,000 years, there'd be very little left, that you would see. So, for example, I talked about the California gold mine discoveries where you have those stone mortars and pestles. And if we observe, if we just assume, say, well, what if living alongside those people, there were also some people using tablet computers and smartphones. After 50 million years, the smartphone or the computer isn't going to be there anymore because the plastics will dissolve, the metals will oxidize. But the stone tool will still be there. It lasts for millions of years. So we may not be getting a complete record. Now, there are some interesting things, however, that have been found. I didn't mention, like I said, I only mentioned a few things, but one case I mentioned in Forbidden Archaeology was a case of a copper coin-like object that came from a well boring in the state of Illinois, I think at a place called Long Spring in Illinois. There was a well boring that had gone down 114 feet. And from that level, they brought up, a researcher from the Smithsonian Institution reported this, they brought up a round copper object that had on both sides of it human figures and a script in an unknown language. And it appeared to be like a coin. So we got in touch with the State Geological Survey of Illinois, and we gave them the drilling record because as part of the scientific report, there was a drilling record that the drill had gone down through 5 feet of clay, 6 feet of sand, 3 feet of sandstone. So we gave them the drilling record and said, how old is the level at 114 feet? We didn't tell them about the coin because they may not have answered. But they said, okay, from that level is between 200,000 and 400,000 years. And then other discoveries were made in the same location, showing evidence of what appeared to be copper objects that were used on sailing craft. Like different things like, like for attaching sails to spars, copper rings and things like that. So, according to standard theories, the first coins were made less than 3,000 years ago in Asia Minor, a place called Lydia. So to have, some kind of coins, that seems to indicate some kind of developed political system, economic system. If you look in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, they describe how people in ancient times had flying craft, weapons resembling nuclear weapons, things of that sort. So, but I think those are all questions for future research. I think what I've established in Forbidden Archaeology is that humans, if you're going to have any type of human technology or culture, high or low, however you want to categorize it, first thing is you have to have human beings. So I think it at least established that. And then what their levels of culture were, that's for future research. Okay, we'll go back to the back. Gentleman in the hat.
Do you have any idea of what's happened? Can you tell by the rock layers or the formations that happened in about that time if there were any major dramatic changes in the planet that could wipe these people out?
So there are some kind of indications of periodic catastrophes that have taken place on Earth. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of my ideas are influenced by my studies in Vedic cosmology, as recorded in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, which describe vast periods, vast cycles of time. And these writings say that, over Well, let me first say the basic unit of this cyclical time that I'm talking about is called the Kalpa, or the Day of Brahma. It lasts about 4 billion years. And it's followed by a night of Brahma that lasts 4 billion years roughly. And then there's another day, another night, another day, another night. During the days, life is manifest in the cosmos, and during the nights, it's in a dormant condition. And according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we're now about halfway through the current Kalpa. In other words, it started about 2 billion years ago, a couple billion years ago, which is roughly when science says life started on Earth, between 2 and 3 billion years ago. They say that Kalpa, or Day of Brahma, is divided into 14 subcycles called Manvantars, each lasting 300 million years. And we're now in the 7th Manvantar. That means there have been 6 before us. And according to the text, at the end of each Manvantar, there's a devastation, a huge cosmic flood that basically wipes out life on Earth. So according to those texts, there have been 6 major devastations over the past 2 billion years, spaced at intervals of several hundred million years. Now, according to modern paleontology, it's basically the same picture, that life begins a couple billion years ago, and since that time there have been 6 major extinction events, the last one being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. And during these so I think it's kind of interesting that this ancient cosmology talks about 6 devastations over the past couple billion years. Modern science is talking about 6 major extinction events that have taken place over that period of time. It's kind of an interesting parallel. So I think from the standpoint of modern science, if you look into those extinction events, they could involve flooding, they could involve cosmic impact events of meteors or comets, or volcanic activity. There is evidence for periodic catastrophic events that have taken place. Okay, we'll go to the back.
All right. I have a question. Virginia Steen McIntyre, she was basically, she had to self-publish. Is that right? Or she had to put the information out herself? It wasn't really backed by anybody?
Her initial report, she and her colleagues were able to get an initial report about their dating of the Waiatliko site, published in a scientific journal called Quaternary Research. But the result of that was that they experienced a lot of negativity and suffered professionally for it.
So
Then what happened, if I can finish, is I wrote about her case in Forbidden Archaeology, and it was one of the cases that Bill Coty included in that NBC documentary, The Mysterious Origins of Man, and that got nationwide attention. And there was a philanthropist, a man interested in archaeology who had some means. He decided to fund new research at Waiatliko, and he did it with professional geologists, archaeologists, and others. They went back there to reinvestigate the site. And Virginia Steen McIntyre went back to give some guidance. And basically what they found, what the majority conclusion was, that the new studies kind of confirmed what she had originally said. And there was a study that was published in an online paleontology journal. So it did so there was some new publication about that case as well. Does that answer your question?
So she didn't go mainstream though, and basically wasn't really accepted anywhere. Now, have you heard of Melba Ketchum and Lloyd Pye?
Lloyd Pye, I've heard.
Okay, well, Melba Ketchum is a very well-known DNA specialist who has taken samples of Sasquatch finger, or supposed unknown hominoid finger, which is it's a knuckle, and it's over 7 inches long. And she's got DNA samples of it, but basically she had to self-publish, and nobody will recognize.
Yeah, well, that sometimes happens. But, I mean, there's so many ways of communicating these days. I mean, just my personal philosophy is I try to reach all the different audiences in as many different ways as possible. But there are so many ways for people to communicate these days. But if one's interested in trying to publish in academic and scientific circles, I think there are some small openings for that. I have found some way to get some of my publications into peer-reviewed academic publications. Not extensively, but to some extent. So it is possible. Yes, in the back there.
In Atlantis Rising magazine, say 5 years ago, there was an article, now you didn't write it, but in the magazine was a picture of nothing but the Atlantic Ocean and the bottom of Africa and the Philippines were all one giant landmass. Did you see that picture? And from that picture, I realized, wow, what we always see is us glued together and then falling and separating out. But this was amazing. Now, did you see that photo?
Well, if you're talking about, I don't know exactly what photo that you're talking about, but many geologists today do believe that at one point all of our separate continents today were joined together in one landmass they called Pangaea. So,
Well, this is all of that is underwater. The Indian Ocean is one big landmass.
oh, you mean sunken continents?
Yeah, so I guess we can just get water off the ocean, Indian Ocean. There'll be lots of artifacts down there.
Well, it is very interesting. Like I regularly attend meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, European Association of Archaeologists, and marine archaeology is becoming a very prominent and growing field, even in the mainstream archaeological circles, because they realize that over the past thousands and thousands of years, the sea levels have been rising, which means in 10 or 20,000 years ago, during the height of the Ice Age, when most of the water was, when a lot of the Earth's water was solidified in the form of ice, the ocean levels went down. And that means there were populated areas that are now covered by water because the ocean levels have been rising. And they understand that. And there have been a lot of cases where, like, dredging in the North Sea, fishers, they bring up fishing boats, they bring up human artifacts from the Paleolithic period, from underwater sites in the North Sea, for example. Or there have been discoveries off the coast of India of sunken cities and things of that sort. So you're correct that, and even mainstream archaeologists today would admit that marine archaeology, underwater archaeology, they used to just concentrate on shipwrecks. But now they're beginning to understand that there are human remains to be found. So that's a good point. Okay, we'll go to the middle. Yes. Did you ask a question yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, just want to spread it around.
Okay. I'm presently reading a book called After Disclosure. Disclosure being the ultimate revelation and awareness that UFOs are real, EBEs, which is extraterrestrial biological entities, have been coming here for millions of years. When that happens, and much is revealed about our planetary history and humankind, how much blowback do you think there will be from the scientists, the archaeologists who have resisted intellectual honesty, perhaps? How much blowback will there be from them? What will happen to their egos?
We can
They're
just
going to hail
imagine.
you as a pioneer.
You know, it's hard to, I mean, see, what I found very interesting in my work, I mean, part of my work that I found very interesting was digging into all these reports and finding them. But even more interesting than that is presenting and seeing what the reaction is. I mean, I've kind of told you what some of the reactions are. So I look at what I'm doing as an experiment, not just in terms of archaeological evidence, but in terms of, you could say, the sociology of science. You know, how it works, how it's organized. And I think the only way you can find the answers to the kinds of questions that you're asking is to do the disclosing and see what the reaction is, or do the research and report the results and see what the reaction is. And I think you also have to look at things in terms of the involvement of governments, because we're not just talking about like open, fair debate. You know, for example, in most countries in the world, governments have given supporters of the dominant theories of human origins an absolute monopoly in the education system, which means they're putting the government's weight, you know, behind keeping their ideas in place. It's, if you were to try to present something else, as some have tried to do, you'll find you're accused of violating the Constitution or this, you know, like, so it's, so I think the involvement of governments also has to be looked at. And, you know, there's kind of a, I mean, they used to talk about the military-industrial complex. It's like now the government education complex. But, so, we'll just have to see, you know, what happens. And I found that to be a very interesting part of my work, and just see what happens. And we'll see. Okay, yes? Yes, yes.
I've got two questions. What made you go from the Vedas to Forbidden Archaeology, number one, and number two, do you think Darwin actually read the Vedas?
So what made me personally go? Well, as I've said on some recent interviews on the radio, one has to take into account the way I was raised. And my father was a military intelligence officer. And that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. It meant our family was living in a lot of different places outside the United States. And that had the effect of opening my mind to the understanding that there's more than one way to look at the world. American way is one way. There are other people who have different ways of looking at the world. As I discovered when I crossed the border into Canada. It's a different way of looking at the world. So so I got exposed to a lot of different worldviews, and among them was the ancient spiritual culture of India. So I became attracted to that. I later became the disciple of the Guru from India. But as part of that, I began studying the Vedic histories, the Puranas, which are the historical writings. And the Puranas contain accounts of extreme human antiquity, human civilizations that existed in the very, very distant past. So I had to decide, how am I going to relate to that? Because it was something completely different that I learned from my teachers in high school or university. And one way I could have dealt with it is just, well, take it as mythology and just do my meditation and whatever, and just treat that as mythology. And just continue to accept what I learned, from my teachers in high school and university. But I decided, along with a colleague, Richard Thompson, who was a co-religionist of mine, no longer with us in this world, we decided to take another approach and actually just look and see if there might not be some physical and scientific evidence that would be consistent with what the Vedic histories were saying. And when I started that research, I didn't know that there would be any, because in the current textbooks there certainly isn't any. But I decided I'm going to look beyond the textbooks, look into the original scientific reports. And when I did that, I found there were numerous reports of evidence consistent with what the Puranas, the Vedic histories, were saying. And initially I just thought I might do 8 weeks of research, write a short little article about it, and then go on to some other question. But when I started the research, the one report led to another. The 8 weeks turned into 8 months. The 8 months turned into 8 years. And then when we start presenting that stuff out in the scientific world and universities, just more opportunities came. So it became like a whole career for me. Whether Darwin read the Vedas, sometimes I hear stories that he did, but I haven't been able to actually verify that, from his diaries or.
Do you personally believe that he
I have heard, but I don't know. I mean, some people have said that he was aware of them. I don't have any direct proof of that myself. Do you?
No, it's just that when you're reading the Vedas, and I put myself in Darwin's shoes, I can actually get to the point where he must have thought that the evolution of consciousness has something to do with the evolution of...
Yeah, that is one possibility, because according to the Vedas, there is an evolution of consciousness through different forms until it achieves a perfect state. So how are we doing, Patrick?
If you want to finish this question and then do another one, we can wrap it up.
Okay, we'll take one more question, and we were going back to this side, so this side gets the last. Have you asked the question yet? Okay.
I wonder if you can speak a bit about the clerk spheres. Back about 3 billion.
Well, this was a case that came to my attention when I was working on Forbidden Archaeology. And what they are is they're kind of round hematite spheres that come from a mine in South Africa, in a place called Ottosdal in the Western Transvaal region. And the most interesting feature of these hematite spheres is the parallel grooves that go around the equator of each one. And in Forbidden Archaeology, what I said is, in the absence of any convincing natural explanation of how those grooves were formed, we would have to consider the possibility that they were intelligently put there. Now, the interesting thing about the spheres is they're found in mineral deposits over 2 billion years old. So up to this point, I haven't seen a convincing naturalistic explanation of how those kinds of parallel grooves could have formed on those objects.
There was even evidence of them having some kind of power inside as well.
Well, that I have, I mean, there are, according to, see, what happened is the original report that came to my attention was from a publication that's considered extremely disreputable in scientific circles, World Weekly News or something. I forget the exact name. But that wasn't the basis on which I put it in Forbidden Archaeology. What I did is I got in touch with the director of the museum where some of these objects are kept and asked him for any scientific information that he had along with photographs, and he provided them to me. But in the original weekly World News report, it mentioned that the object, one of them was on display in the Museum of Natural History in Klerksdorp, South Africa. And it was stated that it would rotate on its own in its display case. Now, I will say also that after Forbidden Archaeology was published, a Dutch television producer saw the description I'd written in the book and the photograph, and he wanted to go down to South Africa and film it, this particular object. And we put Lori, my assistant, put him in touch with the director of the museum, and a man named Rolf Marx. And he replied to us that the object had been stolen from the museum by a person he characterized as being a, quote, white witch. So I hope it's being put to good use. Okay, Patrick. Thank you.
All right, so that'll conclude the Q&A session. I appreciate everybody. We appreciate the broad perspective and the unique questions that everybody brought forward tonight. One last question for Michael before everybody leaves. Why should they buy your books?
I think most of them already have.
Well, why should they buy another one tonight before they leave?
Well, If there is a new book here, My Science, My Religion, with 24 academic papers in it, but these books will let you know what Forbidden Archaeology is all about. And there's a lot of stuff in the books that I didn't talk about tonight. Things about consciousness studies, paranormal powers, scientists who've investigated the paranormal, my ideas about extraterrestrial life and things like that. So if there's a book of mine that you don't have, tonight would be a good night to get it because you'll save on all the shipping costs of shipping books to Canada, which is
Painful.
quite expensive.
And you'll get an autograph.
And you get an autograph, and I'll be here to do that.
You guys are beautiful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So I will be here.
So Michael will be making himself available behind this table. So if you got a book or you want to come and say hi, shake his hand, you're more than welcome to.
I can't find it.
Just make a donation. 5, 10.
No, I know, but I have.
Oh, you have it.
Got it. This is 45.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I shall.
What is this one about? This one is like going on a virtual tour with Michael when he goes to lectures all over the world, and he's breaking research on human evolution, papers he's presented, synopses. It's very short, condensed articles, so it's real easy to read. But it gives a broad overview of what he does. So it's real interesting.
That's a fantastic technology to be used.
There was Indian marine geologists.
They were just boosted, but they were here. He doesn't know how long they were here, but it just says they were here.
They were apes. They weren't humans like us.
Well, he calls them Homo erectus, which is not really a name.
We assume, for the purpose of this discussion, that Jerome got it wrong, then and that we didn't come from apes, what's the alternative explanation for modern man appearing, shall we say?
I explained that in my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And basically what I'm proposing is that bodies are vehicles for conscious selves. And because conscious selves have different desires, when they come to this level of reality, there's a full range of vehicles, including the human vehicle. It's provided, and just like as humans, we're normally meant to live on the land. If I want to live underwater in an alien element, then I need a submarine or a diving suit that will allow me to function there. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from an engineer who understands a human being is going to live under the water. It needs a vehicle like that, so they design it, build it, and then we use it. So similarly, as beings of pure consciousness, we exist in a realm beyond matter. If we come to the realm of matter, there are higher conscious beings who design and build different vehicles for us, including the human vehicle. It's always been available.
And how do they discover that skeleton if the earth and the rock above it is not being
Well,
Through the Conspiracy Culture website.